Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I preach every week. What you are about to hear is a recording of something that I'll try and present this coming Sunday. By the time you've heard this, I will have already presented it. So if you are there in church and you've listened to this, you'll have to tell me how they compare. Sometimes there are differences. But today, and on Sunday, we'll be going over a fairly well-known Bible passage. It's the one where Jesus is being bombarded by mothers, at least that's my impression, bombarded by mothers, clamoring to bring their infant children to him, probably to receive a blessing. Maybe some of them are needing healed. And his disciples, apparently wanting to maintain some sense of decorum, try to bar the way and keep the children away from Jesus. But in a line now famous, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them." And we'll reflect more on this passage and the verses that surround it in just a moment. But first, I have the usual announcements and the housekeeping issues. If you listen to this every week, you know what I'm about to say. Maybe you fast forward to after I give these announcements. Or maybe you might catch something you missed. So either way, here goes. First, I'd like you to learn more about my church. And if you would like to learn more about my church, the best way for you to do that probably would be to talk directly to me, the pastor. And you can reach me at my email, which is my name, Heath, at indyncc.org. That's Heath at ndncc.org. Or if you'd like a less direct route, you might peruse our website. It needs updated, admittedly, but the information on it is updated and current. You can find that at www.indyncc.org. That's indyncc.org. And I should also say, before we proceed, that this podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. The All Indiana Podcast Network produces podcasts made by Hoosiers and often about topics of interest to those of us who live in this lovely state. This is not to say that these topics are not also about and for others who live outside of Indiana. And either way, if that means you, I think you should check them out. You may do so by visiting wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. Before those housekeeping issues/announcements, I alluded to the Bible passage that we'll be considering in a moment. But first, we need to pause to have some ads. If you're listening to this as a podcast, you're about to experience an ad break, and so we'll catch you after the break. For everyone else watching, please enjoy this awkward moment of silence. And we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be going over a Bible passage found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 15 through 17. That's Luke 18, 15 through 17. And it reads, "People were bringing even infants to him, that he might touch them," he being Jesus. "And when the disciples saw it, they sternly ordered them not to do it. But Jesus called for them and said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it.'" Now, that last line might be more sobering when you consider what I am about to say, which is an opinion, admittedly, but my opinion is sometimes churches are no places for kids. And before you start raising objections, let me tell you how I learned this. I learned this as a child in church. And I don't mean to say I was sorely mistreated. I learned it in other ways, and I'll tell you about that right now. Because from a very young age, I learned that church was a place where I was supposed to dress up in clothes that I didn't feel comfortable in. Then I was to go to a building that felt very stuffy and very formal, to sit in a stuffy and formal environment quietly. Emphasis on quietly. That is, until the adults were finished singing and talking. And our Sundays began in a classroom near the back. And it was there that we were taught about the Bible. You know, kids learning about anything are curious by nature. And so we were in that setting liable to ask questions, at least at first. It was then that we learned that churches, at least some churches, are not thought of as places for questions, but rather answers. Now, children are curious by nature, but I felt like curiosity was something that I had to learn to be feared, that it might lead me to risky places. But then after class, we'd leave that setting and we'd make our way to the sanctuary for the real church. And if I squirmed in my seat, the adult behind me might snap their fingers and indicate that I was to sit still. If I whispered to a friend, I was told to stop talking or I would be separated from my friends. If I put my knees up on the seat, there was a little more comfort for a time until a certain woman who sat a few rows behind me told me to get my knees off the seat. It seemed like that was the only thing she was looking out for, Heath putting his knees on the pew in front of him, because I can't really remember that particular woman chastising me for anything else, as this seemed to be the solitary cross that she chose to bear, keeping kids' knees off of seats. Oh, and we weren't allowed to turn our head around, at least not very much, to look around the room. This indicated that we were distracted. So, we weren't meant to be distracted. We had to be paying attention to the things of God. So I tried, but the clock was directly behind me. And church would often run overtime, so you'd try to sneak a peek to see. And you knew that once that clock hit a certain mark, church would be over at any time. Sometimes went well over, but you knew once you hit that mark, when it was expected to be out. And once church was finally over, whoosh, we kids were lickety-split out the door running. Yes, running, because you weren't allowed to run in church. That was God's house. And it seemed to me that God was fairly particular about the decor. Apparently God doesn't like footprints on the carpet. And as a kid, I'd think, well, God, maybe you shouldn't have made so much dirt. And maybe you shouldn't have made it so much fun for a child to run in the dirt or in the church, which makes you wonder, is all of this really about God's sentimentality or sensibilities? Either way, church is filled with this. We are known. We church people are known for rules and order. We are known as gatekeepers of correct information. We've been proud at how well our children have sat still in church and behaved, at least some of us, because we have taught ourselves, as we grew up, to fall in line and behave in church and in other places. The adults in church have taken roles, or at least I've seen them take roles similar to the disciples in our story, where we read that they sternly ordered them not to do it, the it being bringing infants up to Jesus. Now, the text doesn't tell us how the methods the disciples employed to try to get the kids to stop crying were implemented or what they did, but I can imagine, because I have received many a shushing in church in my days. Seems like, to be pious and holy, just listening in on this conversation so far, maybe what you've got to do is train the child out of you. It's as if we want the children in the building, the church building, but only in a very controlled setting and with certain parameters in place. And I've lived this. I've experienced it. And I've seen it replicated in many church communities I've encountered as an adult. As I was saying, churches really are no places for kids. And maybe that's why we've decided not to let them behave like children in church. It's almost as if we'd prefer a child-proof church over a child-welcoming one. Now, the old King James Bible renders verse 16 of Luke chapter 18 as, "Suffer the little children to come to me." And it seems like some of the adults in church forgot that this only meant back then, let the children come to me, same as our translations today. But not a few have behaved as if the King James Version doesn't need a modern translation. Suffer the little children to come to me. Suffer, emphasis on suffer, and kids pick up on it when they are barely being tolerated, as if they were a problem. And this is as if Jesus were trying to indicate that dealing with children would be tedious or arduous with that understanding. But this is not what he meant. He means only let the children come near. Let them break up the decorum in order you think you need to serve God in the right way. Now, to get ahead of any misunderstanding, I just want to tell you what we mean by letting the children come near. If you had in your mind children running around, bedlam, anarchy, no, we don't need kids running amok, although there is time for that. But we don't want constant commotion in most places, much less church. And to understand what we mean, we should first return to that word child and all that Jesus may mean by it, because Jesus is not telling us that the rowdiest and least best behaved will inherit the realm of God. No, he is here referring to those attributes in a child that we, as adults, should help them hone and refine. And just what attributes does a child possess that Jesus finds essential to entry into God's realm? Step one, or at least learn it as you go. Well, I have found this footnote in the commentary of one of my Bibles about what attributes Jesus may have in mind. It reads in a footnote to verse 17, quoting, "The qualities of openness, low status, and no claim to achievement characterize the little child." I'll read that again. The qualities of openness, low status, and no claim to achievement characterize the little child. I like that. And let's work with this. Biblical scholars' best understanding of what Jesus may have in mind here. Let's first talk about openness. And I'll expand that to include curiosity, because I can't see how one could be open without being curious about the new possibilities that they are open to. Maybe also because I'm a curious person by nature and I want to see curiosity here, but I think it is there, openness and curiosity. I've already alluded to the fact that curiosity was not encouraged in my church growing up. And I've told the story before, but I'll tell it here again. As a for instance, I was a child, about 10 years old, when we were going over the creation accounts in Genesis 1 through 3. When I pointed out to a Sunday school teacher that in one of the accounts, and there are 2 creation stories in Genesis 1 through 3. Go back and read it, but I digress. As I was saying, in one of those accounts, I noticed that the plants were created before our sun. Now, I must have been learning about photosynthesis at school or something. Maybe that was on my mind. I don't really know, but for some reason in that moment, it didn't make sense to me because I had learned that plants need the sun to survive, not the other way around. And I don't remember what the teacher's answer was when I raised the question, what felt like an honest inquiry, but was received as, I don't know, a threat. But because I remember how she answered, I realized by her tone and annoyance that this classroom wasn't an environment for that kind of exploration. I felt like I had done something wrong, as if my curiosity were wrong, as if to be a child in church, curious as they are, was wrong. And this is completely backwards. This curiosity, this openness that we have as children before it is trained out of us, Jesus indicates here that we need to keep it and be open and curious in these ways to receive the realm of God. Because it's going to turn our world on end in good ways. And we need to be open to that. And this posture of openness that children seem to have by default stands in stark contrast to the ways that many of Jesus' antagonists were closed off. That is, closed off and incurious about his mission and purpose. They seemed more interested in maintaining a system that was a benefit to them for fear that Jesus' message could upset the apple cart. And maybe something like that fear was in the back of the mind of that Sunday school teacher as they were fielding my question. But adults, we don't start out that way, do we? Fearful of curiosity. As a child, probably or perhaps, those people that Jesus was encountering were more open to a more liberating theology, beliefs about God that didn't confine them or hurt them, that they could use to hurt others. But alas, they grew up, didn't they? And forgot to be a child in relation to God. But for Jesus, children are ready to receive God's realm because they are still open to these new possibilities. But a child is more than just open, as if that weren't enough. If that That is an admirable goal by itself, to be open in that way. But the commentator I quoted above wrote that the hallmarks of childlikeness, aside from their openness, is their low status and no claim to achievement. And that sounds like a diss in our culture, doesn't it? This perspective contrasts with our cultural perspective that seems to fetishize people of so-called high status or those of great achievement and success. But children come into this world with nothing but what we give them. No status, no official titles, at least not in most cases, and certainly no claims to achievement. Yet, what do we call them? Having done nothing, we call them precious, adorable, which means worthy of adoration, priceless, and we could go on. There seems to be no limit to the amount of value and worth that we intuitively place on children. In war zones, we'll gladly kill the adult males, or women if they're fighting too. But children are usually thought of as innocent and outside of the fray, which is why we are more than mortified to see children in their innocence killed in humanity's armed conflicts, which is why we are even more mortified to discover that sometimes this is done on purpose and for no other reason than to terrorize. Now, should the children we refrain from bombing grow up, say in 10 years, then maybe we'll kill them and feel nothing of it. But children are worth more. Or are they? It's as if we think of them like cars that depreciate once you've driven them off the lot. It's as if we understand that all children are precious to God, adored by God, and of infinite worthiness to God, to ourselves too, it seems. But then they grow up. And we delude ourselves into thinking that what was true in terms of their innate value as a child no longer counts as an adult. Is this true? Is it true that we lose our worthiness as we age? Jesus wants us to see that no, this is not true. It is not true that we lose value and worth as an adult. We may not say it that bluntly, but it's how we behave. It's our perception of ourselves and others that changes as we grow older. How does it change things, though? Jesus wants us to consider, how does it change things? The picture, to consider that all who die by human hands are still beloved children of God. After all, it's not something you can grow out of, and it's certainly nothing that can be bestowed upon us by earning any title, however exalted. Children need no titles for us to see their worth. They need accomplish no great feat to earn a place in our hearts. They are enough as they are made, for God has made them. And to enter into the realm of God as a child is to walk in with a full understanding of this, of your worth in God's eyes, with no qualifiers. Entering into the realm of God could be like remembering what it felt like to feel worthy as a child, if that was your experience. Or it can be like discovering for the first time that you are as precious and loved as any child ever was. And because your worthiness does not have a shelf life, it has not diminished or reduced with age. You may feel as though you have lost it, but you have not. So what else? Children are open, children are precious and worthy of love, and so are adults. And children have not done anything to earn their place or station in life. I just alluded to this and sort of leaned into this next point a moment ago. And this passage is often interpreted in conversation with another passage in Luke's gospel to emphasize this point. And I'll just read it here. But before I do, I'll set the scene. It's found in Luke chapter 9, so 9 chapters before the one that we're considering today. And in that chapter, there's one scene where Jesus' disciples are in the middle of an argument about who is the greatest in their group. And we think of that as something childish, right? Turns out it's something more adult-like than we'd like to admit. And Jesus knew what they were thinking, so he brought a child alongside him and said something similar to today's passage, "Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me, for the least among all of you is the greatest. To welcome a child, in other words, is to welcome Jesus and then to welcome God. And here Jesus used a child to make a visual point that children hold no offices. They have no official titles. The disciples are arguing about who is in a higher position, and they're jockeying for leverage. But children, they have not proved themselves worthy in this way by hard work or ingenuity. And if they were applying for a job, their resume, a child's resume, well, what should it look like? Let's just say a 2-year-old applies for a job, name, age, and what else? Nothing. A blank page. Likes peas and carrots. Maybe. They've done little to elevate themselves in the esteem of their community except be so darn cute. And here you may forget that we're talking about children. It's ridiculous to think that we'd expect a small child to earn their place in their community before they were worthwhile. So don't worry, that child will grow up, and as she grows, she will be told in various ways that her worth is contingent on her job title, her income, and whatever of her accomplishments may be commodified or sold. This is why sometimes when people lose their jobs, they will kill themselves, because so much is wrapped in that. And other things like titles, positions. And if she cannot find some way to earn money in a way that is deemed appropriate by the culture, then she may well end up poor or worse. But she had to grow up. And along the way, she discovered that she lived in a meritocracy and that who we are is largely defined by what we do. But flip it, Jesus says to enter into the realm of a child is the opposite. It's to enter as one who has no child, as one who has nothing to prove, and that's okay. To enter as a child is to acknowledge that whatever our titles and whatever our cultural status, there was a time before all of that when we did not need to run that race or chase down our worth. Jesus is trying to teach his disciples that as they enter further into God's realm, those titles and status symbols will come to mean less and less, as little as they did back when we were born. But Jesus receives the child. He doesn't ask for the child's LinkedIn, nor does he try and discover if they come from a good home. None of those things matter, their titles or their station. The child comes as they are, unassuming. And in a similar way, we are invited to enter in ourselves. We take our titles and our accolades and set them aside, or if we have none, that's okay too. Most of our achievements won't matter so much in the broader scheme of things anyway, and that's okay. We were never meant to work our way to heaven. Turns out, we never needed to. God has always been ready to accept us along with everyone else. So now let's bring it back to church, where we began with the talk about children and it being no fit place for them. Jesus was talking to his disciples and the crowd of people that surrounded him. And he welcomed a crying infant to make the point. And now, here we are in a church talk. And there are crying infants in church too, let me tell you. Old, stuffy church. As I said, sometimes church is really no place for a kid, which I hope you see by now is the entire problem. We've got to enter into this life of church, like a child, and welcome others in that same spirit. We've got to reclaim some of what was lost with childhood as we grew, which means we must cultivate in our churches a spirit of openness, where new ideas are explored, where differing views about God even are not viewed as existential threats, and where childlike curiosity is encouraged. How if churches, yes, our churches, I know I'm dreaming here, but how if our churches came to be viewed as these kind of places? That was our MO, where the most curious and inquisitive people gather. How if our churches were admired for courageously engaging new ideas in changing times, serving as models for what is possible when a community is open and curious? And this is my heart, this pastor's heart. I hope, I try to be open. And if you're listening to this and don't go to church, I can tell you that this, My church is the most open church that I've ever been a part of, so I'm sneaking in a brag on it. But there's always room for improvement, and this is not all we'll need to do before our churches are good places for kids. How if our churches came to be places, viewed as places where all those titles and accolades meant the very least? How if it was understood that at church a poor person of little acclaim could stand proudly next to anyone else with the understanding that the least of these will be first in God's realm? As if we were taking our titles and accolades and hanging them on the door. They don't matter here. Which is to say, our hierarchies and power structures are built largely on delusions. At church, the poor, the least, and the last may lead. Case in point, we follow Jesus, and Jesus was a poor Middle Eastern man raised in a backwater village by a common laborer. This is who we follow. And people like that should be comfortable in church. But wouldn't it be something if children picked up on this vibe in church and received a message that runs counter to a lot of the propaganda they'll be exposed to in our consumer culture? How if a child in a world that screams at them, get a job, make money, and go make something of your life? How if the dominant message were, let the little children come? Children who have not bought into the lies of our consumer culture about themselves and their worth. How if children were bombarded with messages in church that enforced their worthiness and place in God's realm? But lastly, I want to talk about one thing I haven't brought up yet that I've been thinking about since the start. Something that I think should be implied when we're talking about children. I'm thinking here of play. Children play, no surprise, but not in church. That much has been made clear. Trust me. At least sometimes. Seems to be the message. And this seems to me to be wrong somehow. Seems like children are meant to play. And it seems backwards to tell them that the one place that they need to be the best behaved and have the least fun should be in God's house. I mean, you know how stressful it is. There's someone in your life, I guarantee you, where their house has a lot of rules and unspoken ways of being in that house. Take your shoes off. Don't do this. Make sure you do that. Don't touch this. Stay off that. Be quiet there. It's stressful being in a place like that. And this is the message we send to children at church, that God is a stuffy housekeeper who likes you to keep your feet off of his lawn. Well, is God a stuffy housekeeper? Seems to me like all of this has to do with our own hang-ups and sensibilities. If we are to take Jesus' saying here seriously, then we should consider that the life Jesus calls us to is not ordered or stuffy. It is often unpredictable and messy. Like, well, children. Children are unpredictable and messy. And this is okay. This is life. Shouldn't church reflect this? And children are the ones who get it, says Jesus. It is they who understand that there should be joy and laughter in church, that churches should be places where people feel the freest to be themselves, which is why we've got to remember what it was like to be in church as a child. We've got to remember what it felt like to want to play, unselfconsciously and with no shame. We've got to remember how it was to ask questions without fear or reprisal. We've got to learn the lessons that we've picked up as we approached adulthood and then unlearn them because they have robbed us of our ability to see ourselves and others for what they are worth. Growing up has done this to us. But understand this before we conclude. This passage isn't really about children, not in the literal sense. It's about you and it's about me. It's about the ways we've let the child in us die. Turns out, what we had as children, we were never meant to lose. Our openness, our curiosity, our desire to play, our innate sense of worth. So let us try and get it back. Pray to God for it back. Then move forward through life like a child deserves to, open to the world, not caring about social status, and knowing there is nothing necessary for us to do except receive and reflect the love of God. And play. Play and forget to think about how silly you look. When we can do all of this, well, when adults in church can do all of this and remember our inner child, church might finally become a good place for a child to be.